In the freezing Roman rain, a widow and her two small children were thrown into the street. Their belongings were tossed into the mud, a spectacle for the merciless crowd. The moneylender who had taken their home simply watched, a cruel smirk on his face as Livia clutched her son and daughter. They had nothing left. Just as all hope seemed lost, the litter of a passing general stopped. In a final act of desperation, she ran and fell to her knees before him. "Help us!" she cried, her voice cracking against the sound of the rain. "We have nowhere to go." The guards moved to cast her aside, but the general, a man with eyes as hard as iron, gave a single sharp nod. For more stories where Roman honor becomes a shield for the helpless, join our legion by subscribing and tell us what country you are watching from. The sound that broke the world was the splintering of wood. Not the loud crash of a falling tree, but the intimate, violent crack of a door torn from its frame. For 6-year-old Lucius, it was a thunderclap in their small home. For his mother, Livia, it was the sound of her life ending. Two brutish men, their faces impassive, stepped into the room, their wet sandals staining the floorboards. Behind them, framed in the doorway against the grey, weeping sky of Rome, stood Gaius Fulvius. He was a man built of soft flesh and hard angles, his expensive toga a stark white against the grime of the... He did not enter. He merely observed, a faint, almost bored smile on his lips as his men began to work. They moved with a practiced efficiency, grabbing the few pieces of furniture, the worn blankets, the clay pots from the hearth. Livia stood frozen, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She clutched the small hand of her 4-year-old daughter, Cassia, whose face was buried in the folds of her mother's worn... Livia's world had shrunk to this single, suffocating room. The scent of rain, the grunts of the men, the quiet, rhythmic tapping of Fulvius's fingers against his arm. He was not angry. He was not cruel in a passionate way. He was something far worse. He was indifferent. This was business. Her husband's debt was a line in a ledger, and she and her children were the final, messy calculation. "Everything," Fulvius said, his voice as smooth and colorless as a washed stone. It was the only word he spoke. The men obeyed. They took the wooden chest that held her husband's old tools. They took the loom where she earned a few spare. They took the small painted dolls that had been Cassia's only toys. Livia did not beg. She did not scream. A strange, hollow pride filled the space where terror should have been. She would not give this man her tears. She had already given him everything else. She watched as the contents of her life were piled in the muddy street outside. The rain began to fall harder, turning the dirt to a thick, greedy slurry that stained and soaked her memories. Faces appeared in the windows of the neighboring apartments. Some looked away quickly, ashamed. Others watched with a detached curiosity. A few, those who also owed debts to men like Fulvius, watched with a cold fear in their eyes. No one came to help. No one spoke a word. To intervene would be to draw the eye of the vulture. When the room was bare, one of the thugs jerked his head toward the door. The message was clear. Livia took a breath, pulling Cassia closer while her other hand found Lucius's shoulder. The boy had not cried. He stood straight, his small jaw set, his eyes fixed on Gaius Fulvius with a hatred so pure it was startling in a child so young. He was trying to be the man of the house. The thought broke Livia's heart more than the splintered door. She led her children out into the rain. The cold was immediate, seeping through her thin clothing, chilling her to the bone. She stood beside the pathetic pile of her belongings, a public monument to her failure. Fulvius gave her one last look, a look of utter dismissal, before turning to leave. His business here was concluded. Livia and her children were left alone in the downpour. The street, once filled with the motion of their eviction, grew quiet. The faces in the windows disappeared. The city moved on around them, its great heart beating with an imperial indifference to the fate of one small ruined family. Cassia began to cry, her small sobs lost in the sound of the rain. Lucius shivered, but his eyes never left his mother's face, waiting for an instruction, a sign of what to do next. Livia had no answer. She looked down the long, wet street at the endless grey stone and the rushing gutters. There was nowhere to go, no family to turn to, no sanctuary to be found. This was it. This was the end. The rain washed the last traces of warmth from her skin, and for the first time a true and terrifying despair began to settle in her soul. It was then that a new sound cut through the rhythm of the storm. It was not the clatter of a merchant's cart or the chatter of citizens. It was the measured, heavy tread of military sandals on wet stone, a sound of order and power. Around the corner came a small procession, 4 uniformed guards, their faces grim and disciplined, flanking a covered litter carried by 2 strong servants. It was the transport of a powerful man, a patrician or a military officer, a man who lived in a different world. The procession moved toward them, an island of purpose in the aimless rain. For a moment, fear sparked in Livia's chest. Was this another agent of Fulvius, sent to inflict some final cruelty? She pulled her children behind her, a useless, instinctive gesture of protection. The guards did not slow. The litter drew closer, its curtains drawn against the weather, hiding its occupant from view. It was about to pass them to continue on and leave them to their fate in the gutter. But then, without a command, it stopped. A moment stretched into an eternity. The rain fell, the guards stood like statues of granite, and Livia's world hung suspended in the silent space between one breath and the next. She expected the litter to move on, to disappear, and leave them to the cold. It did not. Slowly, the heavy curtain was pulled aside. Livia saw not a full figure, but a glimpse of a world she did not know. The clean, dark wool of a military cloak, the glint of polished leather, and then a face, etched with lines that spoke of sun and steel rather than Senate chambers. It was a hard face, anchored by a jaw that seemed carved from stone, and a faint silver scar that cut through one eyebrow. The man's eyes were not cruel, nor were they kind. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the world be devoured and had survived. His gaze swept over her, taking in her drenched state, her daughter's terrified face. But it did not linger. It settled on her son, Lucius. It settled on the small boy standing with his chin up and his fists clenched, a tiny, defiant legionary protecting his last inch of ground. The man in the litter saw not a child, but an echo of a courage he understood. And in that instant, Livia saw a flicker of something in his expression. It was not pity. It was recognition. It was enough. A fire, born of a mother's last stand, tore through Livia's despair. Before her mind could weigh the consequences, before fear could reclaim its hold, her body moved. She pushed off from the wall, stumbling past the pile of her ruined life, and ran toward the litter. It was an act of madness. A common woman did not approach a noble's litter. The guards reacted instantly. Their hands went to the hilts of their swords, their bodies shifting into a wall of muscle and metal. One stepped forward to intercept her, his arm raised not to strike, but to shove her back into the gutter where she belonged. Time seemed to slow. She could see the rough texture of his leather vambrace, the cold rain dripping from his helmet's crest. This was the end of her foolish gamble. But she did not stop. She ducked under his arm, her desperation giving her a speed she did not know she possessed. She fell to her knees in the mud and cold water before the opening of the litter, her hands clasped together. She did not look at the guards. She looked only at the shadowed face of the man inside. "Help us," she cried, her voice raw and breaking, a sound torn from the deepest part of her soul. "We have nowhere to go." The words hung in the air, a desperate prayer offered to a silent God. The guard she had evaded loomed over her, his face a mask of cold fury at her transgression. He reached down to grab her arm, to haul her up and throw her aside. The city seemed to watch, holding its breath. This was the final humiliation. Then, from within the litter, came the briefest, sharpest of gestures. The general did not speak. He simply lifted his hand and gave a single, decisive nod. It was a command as absolute as any given on a battlefield. The guard froze, his hand hovering inches from Livia's arm. His face, once hard with duty, was now a mask of confusion. He looked back at the litter, seeking confirmation. The general's expression was unchanged, his eyes like flint. The guard understood. He straightened up, his posture shifting in a way that was both subtle and profound. He was no longer a barrier, he was a sentinel. He turned and, with another guard, took up a position that placed Livia and her children their protection. They formed a small, disciplined circle, their backs to her, facing out at the empty street, as if it held an advancing enemy. The world was shut out. The rain still fell, the wind still cut, but they were inside a sudden, bewildering fortress of Roman steel. Livia remained on her knees, her head bowed, trembling not from cold but from shock. She did not understand what had happened. She did not know the name of the man in the litter, nor the reason for his impossible act of mercy. She only knew that one moment she had been drowning, and the next, a hand had reached down from an unbelievable height and pulled her from the depths. The general's voice, when it finally came, was as rough and deep as stones grinding at the bottom of a river. "Get up," he said, not unkindly, but with the simple economy of a commander. One of the guards offered Livia a hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, and pulled her from the mud. Another lifted a sleepy Cassia, while a third placed a steadying hand on Lucius's shoulder. They were ushered toward the litter. The journey was a silent, swaying blur. Inside, the space was dark and smelled of leather and rain. Livia sat on a simple bench, her children pressed close against her, their wet clothes soaking the cushions. The general sat opposite them, a formidable shadow in the gloom. He did not speak. He did not look at them. He stared out through the small gap in the curtains, his profile a rigid line against the grey backdrop of the city they were leaving behind. Livia's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a captive, a charity case, a piece of battlefield salvage being brought back to camp. She did not know which. They travelled beyond the city walls, where the noise and filth of the crowded streets gave way to the clean, green quiet of the countryside. The litter finally came to a stop before a set of high stone walls. Gates were opened, and they passed into a large courtyard. The villa was not opulent. It was a soldier's house, built of solid stone and timber, its lines clean and severe. There were no frivolous statues, no brightly coloured mosaics in the entryway. There was only order, discipline, and a profound, echoing silence. They were led into a vast Spartan hall open to the grey sky. A light rain fell into a central pool, the drops creating ripples that were the only source of movement in the house. A stern-looking woman in her later years, her grey hair bound in a severe knot, appeared as if from the stone itself. She was the housekeeper, and her face was a mask of disciplined neutrality as she took in the sight of the soaked and mud-stained woman and her children. "Drusilla," the general said, his voice echoing in the hall. "These are guests. See that they are given rooms. They will need food and dry clothes." The housekeeper, Drusilla, gave a short, stiff bow. "At once, General." She looked at Livia, her eyes missing nothing, but offering no judgment. The general looked at Livia, truly looked at her, for the first time. His gaze was heavy, analytical. He was a man assessing a problem. "You will be safe here," he stated. It was not a promise meant to comfort. It was a statement of fact. Then, without another word, he turned and strode down a long corridor, his military cloak swirling behind him. He disappeared behind a heavy wooden door, which closed with a quiet final click. He had brought them into his fortress, and then retreated to its innermost keep. Drusilla gestured for Livia to follow. They were led to a modest but immaculately clean room. It contained simple rope beds with clean wool blankets, a small table, and a single shuttered window. The stone floors were bare but swept clean. Compared to the life she had just lost, it was a palace. Compared to the house it was a part of, it was a cell. Minutes later, a servant brought a tray. On it was a steaming bowl of kas, a simple grain porridge, along with a loaf of dark bread and a pitcher of water. Drusilla returned with a stack of folded clothes. They were plain, the tunics of servants, but they were clean and dry. "The general's orders," she said, her expression unreadable, and then she was gone, leaving them in silence. Livia stripped the cold, wet rags from her children and wrapped them in the rough, warm blankets. She broke the bread and spooned the warm porridge into their mouths. They ate with a hunger that was painful to watch. Lucius devoured his portion quickly, while Cassia, exhausted, ate slowly, her eyelids fluttering. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Livia felt the knot of terror in her stomach begin to loosen. Her children were warm. They were fed. They were safe from the rain and the predatory eyes of the world. After they had eaten, she tucked them into one of the beds. Cassia was asleep instantly, her small face peaceful in the dim light. Lucius fought sleep for a moment, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar room, before he too succumbed, his small hand still clutching a piece of the bread. Livia sat on the edge of the other bed, pulling a dry blanket around her own shoulders. The warmth seeped into her bones, a feeling so welcome it was almost painful. She could hear the rain drumming softly on the roof tiles outside. It was the same rain that had been her tormentor only an hour before, but now it was just a sound that could not reach her. She was in a stranger's house, a guest of a hard, silent man she did not know. Her future was a terrifying blank, but for the first time in so long she could not remember, she could breathe. She closed her eyes and took a long, slow breath, the first one that did not feel like she was still drowning. Days bled into weeks, and a quiet, unspoken rhythm began to settle over the general's villa. It was a life lived in the spaces between words, a routine built on observation and silence. Livia and her children were ghosts in the house at first, moving through the stark corridors with a hushed reverence, careful not to disturb the profound quiet that seemed to be its true master. The general remained a distant, formidable presence, taking his meals alone in his study and spending his days reviewing maps and scrolls, a man still fighting old wars in his mind. But in this silence, a new language began to form. It was not spoken, but acted. It began with the children. Marcus, from the shadows of his study's doorway, would watch Lucius in the courtyard. The boy, having no toys, would practice with a fallen branch, mimicking the stances of the guards. He was clumsy, but his posture was serious, his imaginary foe a great threat. One morning, leaning against the door to their room, Lucius found a wooden. It was perfectly weighted for a child's hands, its edges blunted, its surface sanded smooth. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was only the gift. Livia saw the way her son's eyes lit up, the way he clutched the sword as if it were a holy relic. She knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, where it had come from. That evening, after the household was asleep, she noticed the cold draught that seeped from under the general's study door. She found an unused bronze brazier, filled it with hot coals from the kitchen hearth, and placed it silently outside his room before she retired. It was a small gesture, a quiet offering of warmth against the cold. The conversation continued. Marcus noticed Livia shivering as she crossed the open air on a brisk morning, her thin servant's cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was trying to make herself smaller, to take up less space in his world. The next day, Drusilla the housekeeper approached her, holding a folded garment. It was a lady's cloak, made of wool so fine it felt like water. Its color was the deep blue of the evening sky. It was a garment of status, of dignity. "The general thought your other cloak was insufficient for the season," Drusilla said, her voice betraying nothing. Livia took it, her fingers tracing the fine fabric, her heart a confusion of gratitude and bewilderment. With this small measure of dignity, Livia grew bolder. She turned her attention to the central garden courtyard. It was a place of mourning, planted only with the dark green of victory laurels and the funereal spires of cypress trees. It was the garden of a man who lived only with his past. Livia, using her knowledge of country things, found a neglected patch of earth behind the kitchens. She began to cultivate it, transplanting wild herbs and the few stubborn flowers she could find. Soon, a small splash of color and the scent of thyme and lavender began to challenge the garden's solemnity. She was planting life in a place dedicated to memory. Marcus saw it. He would stand at the edge of the colonnade and watch her work, her hands in the dirt, bringing order and beauty to his place of grief. One afternoon, he overheard a stable hand gossiping with a guard, referring to Livia with a callous word. "The general's charity." The man had sneered. Marcus did not speak. He did not raise his voice. He simply emerged from the stables, his shadow falling over the men. He fixed the stable hand with a look, a cold, flat glare that had once frozen the blood of barbarian warriors. The man's smirk vanished. By morning he was gone. The message was sent to the entire household without a single word. She was not charity. She was under his protection. Livia, in turn, noticed the things he tried to hide. On damp nights he walked, with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, an old wound from a long-forgotten war. She recognized the sharp, biting pain in the way he held himself, the tightness in his jaw. She went to the garden she was now tending, gathering specific herbs. That night, she crushed them into a warm poultice, bound it in a clean strip of linen, and left it on the small table outside his study, next to the now empty brazier. When Marcus found it, he stopped. He looked at the small, warm bundle, and his first instinct, the instinct of a soldier, was to reject it. It was a comfort. It was a recognition of weakness. He had tended his own wounds for years alone, but the leg ached with a familiar, grinding pain. The scent of the herbs, a scent of the earth and of healing, filled the cold corridor. He took the poultice, entered his study, and closed the door. Alone, in the flickering lamplight, he unwrapped the linen. He hesitated for a long moment. Then slowly he applied the warm, fragrant balm to the scarred flesh above his knee. The relief was not just physical. It was a warmth that seeped deeper than muscle and bone. It was the first act of gentle care he had allowed himself to accept in a decade. And in that quiet, solitary room, a silent vow of trust was answered. The poultice was a small, warm weight in the general's hand, but it felt as heavy as a foundation stone. For years his pain had been a private, familiar companion. It was a penance, a constant reminder of his failure. To accept comfort felt like a betrayal of the memory of those who had received none. Yet he had. He had accepted this small kindness, and in doing so had unknowingly opened a door to a room in his mind he had kept locked and barred for a decade. The next afternoon he stood by the columns of the peristyle, watching Lucius and Cassia. The children, no longer timid ghosts, had brought life back to the silent stones. Lucius was locked in a fierce, imaginary battle with a cypress tree, his wooden sword a blur of motion. Cassia was sitting in Livia's new herb garden, carefully arranging fallen petals on a stone, her soft humming the only sound in the courtyard. It was a scene of such profound peace. It was a torment. The sound of Cassia's humming, innocent and carefree, was the key that turned in the rusted lock. The world of the villa dissolved, the warm Italian sun replaced by a cold, clinging mist. The scent of lavender was overwhelmed by the smell of damp earth and blood. He was no longer Marcus Valerius Aquila, a retired general in his villa. He was legate of the 9th Legion, deep in the cursed, fog-choked forests of Caledonia. His memory of that day was not a clean narrative, but a series of brutal, visceral images. The unnatural silence of the forest, a silence that had put every veteran on edge. The sudden, terrifying blast of a barbarian war horn, its sound like the scream of a dying beast. And then the explosion of violence from all sides. The trees themselves seemed to sprout warriors, their faces painted in horrifying swirls of blue woad, their long swords and axes cleaving through Roman discipline. It was a perfect trap. They had been lured into a narrow pass, their columns stretched thin. The ambush was not just an attack, it was an annihilation. He remembered the chaos, the screams of men, the clang of steel on steel, the sickening wet sound of blades finding flesh. He had fought, his voice raw from shouting orders that were swallowed by the din of battle, his arm a machine of death and desperation. But the sharpest, most unforgivable memory was not of the battle itself. It was of the baggage train at the rear of the column. It was where the families were, the wives, the children, the merchants who followed the legion, creating a small moving piece of Rome in the heart of barbarism. His legion was not just an army, it was a world, and he was its guardian. Through the maelstrom of combat, he heard their screams, a different sound from the cries of wounded soldiers. It was the sound of pure terror, the sound of innocence being slaughtered. He saw the face of his most trusted centurion's wife, her mouth open in a scream that made no sound just before she was pulled down. He saw a small boy, no older than Lucius, standing frozen in shock before a charging warrior. He had failed them. In the end, his duty was not to the emperor, not to the abstract glory of Rome, but to the lives of the people under his command, soldiers and civilians alike. He had led them all into a grave. He and a handful of his men had cut their way out, a desperate, bloody retreat through miles of hostile territory. They had survived, but survival was not a victory. It was a mark of shame. They were the ones who had lived while everyone else had perished in the fog. He had returned to Rome not as a hero, but as a ghost, the commander of a legion that no longer existed. The vision faded. The scent of blood was replaced again by the scent of herbs. The screams were gone, leaving only the sound of a little girl's humming. Marcus gripped the stone column, his knuckles white. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at Livia, who was now showing Cassia how to gently water the plants. He looked at Lucius, who had abandoned his fight and was now trying to balance his wooden sword on his finger. He finally understood why he had stopped the litter. When Livia had fallen before him, her face streaked with rain and tears, crying, "Help us!" He had not seen a stranger. He had seen the centurion's wife. In Lucius's defiant stare, he had seen the boy in the forest. Her desperate plea was an echo of every silent scream that haunted his nights. His intervention had not been an act of charity. It was a desperate, unconscious attempt to win a battle he had lost 10 years ago. He was not protecting her from the world's cruelty. He was trying to protect himself from his own ghosts. The ghosts, once acknowledged, did not vanish. But their presence changed. The guilt that had been a constant, sharp torment for Marcus began to dull into a quiet, heavy ache. He found he could watch the children play, not with a fresh wave of grief, but with a new, fierce surge of protectiveness. The peace he had given Livia was a peace he was slowly, cautiously beginning to share. The villa's silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of life. Livia's humming in the garden, Lucius's shouts of imagined victory, Cassia's quiet chatter to her dolls. The house was breathing again, but the world outside the villa's walls had not forgotten them. In the grimy heart of Rome, Gaius Fulvius nursed his wounded pride. The matter of the debt was trivial, a handful of coins in his vast coffers. The real wound was to his reputation. A debtor's widow had defied him, had escaped her fate, and had found shelter with a man whose name still carried the weight of legend. It was an imbalance in the ledger of power, and it could not stand. Every whisper in the forum, every curious glance from his peers, felt like a judgment on his inability to control what was his. His vengeance, when he chose it, was not a weapon of iron, but of ink and whispers. He could not storm a general's villa, but he could lay siege to his honor. Fulvius began his campaign in the taverns and bathhouses, the breeding grounds of Roman rumor. He spoke not with anger, but with a feigned, sorrowful concern. He spoke of Livia's late husband, hinting at dark dealings and secret partners. He painted a picture of a man whose debts were not the result of failed business, but of a life of treason. The whispers grew, slithering through the city's veins like sewer rats. The story took root. The debtor was a traitor, and his widow was now living under the protection of the reclusive general of the lost 9th Legion. The questions followed, loaded with poison. Why would a man of Marcus's stature involve himself with such a woman? What secrets was she hiding? What weakness had she found in the old soldier? When the soil of public opinion was sufficiently poisoned, Fulvius made his move. He filed a formal petition with the local magistrate. It was a work of insidious genius. He claimed to have uncovered evidence that Livia's husband had been selling shipping manifests to foreign pirates, enemies of Rome. He alleged that the woman, Livia, was complicit and was using the general's protection to hide her crimes. By extension, the great Marcus Valerius Aquila, a hero of the empire, was now harboring a traitor and obstructing Roman justice. The threat did not arrive with the crash of a battering ram, but with the quiet official tap on the villa's main gate. Alone, an agent of the magistrate, stood in the courtyard, his ceremonial staff held before him. He did not come with force, but with the crushing weight of the law. Marcus met him in the atrium. Livia watched from the shadows of the corridor, her heart turning to ice as she saw the official scroll in the hand. The man spoke in a formal, emotionless tone, his words echoing in the vast, silent hall. He read the charges laid by Gaius Fulvius. He spoke the word treason in connection with her husband's name, and he delivered the summons. General Marcus Valerius Aquila and the woman Livia were required to appear before the magistrate in 3 days' time to answer the accusations. The finished, rolled the scroll, bowed stiffly, and departed. He left, behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any the villa had ever known. The fragile peace they had built was shattered. The outside world, with all its cruelty and corruption, had breached their walls. Fulvius had not come for their bodies. He had come for their names, their honor, and their freedom. Marcus stood for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the messenger had been, the summons held tight in his hand. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. The ghosts of Caledonia were gone, replaced by a living, breathing enemy, And this was a battle he could not retreat from. The heavy silence that followed the departure was broken by Livia. She stepped out from the corridor, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her tunic. Fear had returned, cold and sharp, but it was now laced with a profound and bitter guilt. She had brought this disaster to his door. She had repaid his sanctuary with ruin. "I will leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will take the children and go. He will not trouble you further." Marcus turned from the doorway, his eyes locking onto hers. The fury in his expression was not directed at her. It was the cold, contained rage of a commander whose territory had been invaded. "You will do no such thing," he said, his voice low and hard. "You are of this house now. His grievance is with me." He strode past her toward his study, pausing only to place the summons on a small table. "This is not a matter of law," he said, more to himself than to her. "It is a matter of honor." The study door closed, and Livia was left alone with her despair. Marcus would fight, she knew, but he would fight like a soldier. Fulvius was a different kind of enemy, one who fought with lies and whispers, a battlefield of paper and influence where a sword was useless. She thought of her husband, an honest merchant, now branded a traitor. The injustice of it burned through her fear. She would not let his name be destroyed. Among the few pathetic belongings she had managed to save from the street that day was a small locked wooden chest. It held her husband's business ledgers. He had been a meticulous man, recording every transaction, every shipment, every deal. She retrieved the chest and brought it to her room. For 2 days and 2 nights she worked, her world shrinking to the flickering light of an oil lamp and the columns of numbers and notes on the papyrus scrolls. She was not looking for a single piece of evidence. She was looking for an echo, a pattern, anything that did not make sense. On the second night, her eyes burning with fatigue, she found it. It was a small, coded entry in a margin, detailing a private cargo transfer. The date was 3 days after her husband had supposedly taken a large loan from Fulvius, a loan he had never mentioned to her. Cross-referencing the shipment with another scroll, she saw the sigil of the recipient. They were not pirates, but they were foreign agents. Known for illicit trade, men no honorable Roman would deal with. Her breath caught in her chest. Her husband had not made this deal. He had been a cautious man, terrified of such entanglements. But the ledger entry was a perfect match for the charge Fulvius had made. It was then that she understood. It was not her husband's record of a crime, it was his record of Fulvius's crime. Fulvius had used her husband's shipping company as a cover, forced him into debt to ensure his silence, and when he died unexpectedly, had moved to erase the witness and his family. The accusation was not a lie made from whole cloth. It was the truth, twisted and aimed at an innocent, dead man. She did not hesitate. She took the 2 scrolls and went straight to the general's study. She knocked, a sound she had never dared to make before. When he bid her enter, she found him standing over a map of the city, as if planning a campaign. She laid the scrolls on the table. "General," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I have found the weapon you need." She explained her discovery, her finger tracing the lines of ink, her quiet wisdom illuminating the villain's entire scheme. Marcus listened, his expression unmoving, his eyes fixed on the scrolls. He saw the battlefield with a sudden, stunning clarity. He saw the enemy's strategy, his weakness, his overconfidence. Livia had not just given him proof. She had given him the plan of attack. On the 3rd day, the day of the summons, Marcus did not go to the magistrate. He went to the forum. He walked not as a defendant, but as a commander. Livia watched from a distance, hidden in the shade of a colonnade, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Gaius Fulvius was there, holding court with other merchants, a confident smirk on his face. He saw Marcus approach and his smirk widened. He expected a negotiation, a plea. He did not get one. Marcus stopped in the center of the plaza. He did not shout. He spoke, and his voice, honed by years of commanding legions, carried across the stones, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Gaius Fulvius," he called out. A hush fell. Heads turned. "You have accused a dead man of treason and a widow of complicity. You have used the law as a shield for your lies." Fulvius's face paled. "These are matters for a magistrate, General, not for public spectacle." "Matters of honor are always for the public," Marcus countered, his voice like iron. He held up the scroll Livia had found. "This is the Ledger of a good man, a man you drove to ruin. On this page it details a shipment of goods to enemies of Rome. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. But it is not his signature that guaranteed the payment. It is yours. He read the entry aloud. He named the date, the cargo, the recipient, and the amount. The details were too specific, too precise to be a fabrication. The merchants around Fulvius, men who understood ledgers and deals, began to look at him, their expressions shifting, from curiosity to suspicion, and then to contempt. "You are a vulture who feeds on the dead," Marcus said, his voice dropping, yet losing none of its power. "You have no honor. You shame the name of Roman." He did not need to say more. He had not accused Fulvius of a crime in a court of law. He had convicted him in the court of public honor. He rolled up the scroll, gave the trembling, speechless moneylender one last look of utter disgust, and turned his back. The crowd parted for him as he walked away. Behind him, Gaius Fulvius was left alone in a circle of suffocating, judgmental silence. The battle was over. The victory was absolute. The return to the villa was as silent as the journey to the Forum had been. But it was a different silence. The earlier quiet had been taut with tension and uncertainty. This was a silence of relief, of a storm that had passed, leaving the air clean and calm. The victory had been total, but there was no sense of triumph in Marcus. No celebration. There was only a quiet, profound finality. He had defended his home. That evening a sense of deep peace settled over the house. The lamps cast long, warm shadows on the stone floors. The scent of Livia's herbs drifted in from the garden on the cool night air. For the first time, the villa felt less like a fortress and more like a home, a place not just of safety, but of belonging. After the evening meal, Marcus found himself standing in the doorway of the children's room. He did not enter, but watched from the threshold. Lucius and Cassia were sound asleep, their faces soft and untroubled in the gentle glow of a single oil lamp. Lucius's wooden sword lay on the floor next to his bed, where it had fallen from his sleeping grip. Cassia had one arm thrown over a simple rag doll Livia had sewn for her. He watched them breathe, the slow, even rhythm of innocent sleep. These two small lives were now inextricably bound to his. The battle in the Forum had not been fought for. His own honor, which he had long considered a thing of the past, it had been fought for them to protect this, to ensure that their sleep would remain untroubled. For the first time in a decade, he had protected a family entrusted to his care. He had not failed. The ghosts of Caledonia were silent, not gone, but finally at peace. Livia entered the corridor, her soft footsteps making almost no sound. She had been checking that the kitchen was in order for the morning, a simple domestic act that was now her routine, her claim to this house. She saw him standing there and stopped, not wanting to intrude, but he sensed her presence, and a quiet understanding passed between them in the shadows. She came and stood beside him in the doorway. Together, they watched the children. The air was filled with unspoken things. Her gratitude, his relief, their shared victory. Words would have been clumsy, inadequate tools for the profound emotions that filled the space between them. They were no longer a general and a refugee. They were two guardians, standing vigil over their shared heart. Marcus kept his eyes on the sleeping forms of the children. He felt a sense of rightness, a settling in his soul he had never expected to feel again. He had spent his life in service to the vast impersonal idea of Rome, but here, in this small room, was a world far more real, a duty far more sacred. Slowly, without looking at her, he reached out his hand, palm up, into the space between them. It was not a demand, but an offering. Livia looked at his hand. It was a soldier's hand, scarred and calloused, a hand that had held a sword and a standard, a hand that had known violence and death, but it was also the hand that had ordered her rescue, the hand that had provided this sanctuary. She placed her own hand in his fingers closed around hers, a firm, warm, and steady grip. He did not bring her closer. He did not turn to face her. He simply held her hand, his thumb gently stroking the back of her knuckles. It was a gesture of immense, quiet tenderness. It was a language more powerful than any spoken vow. It did not say, it said. Livia's breath caught in her throat. She leaned her head gently against the cool stone of the doorframe and closed her eyes, her hand secure in his. She did not need to answer. Her presence there, Her hand in his was her reply. The unspoken vow was made. In the quiet darkness of the villa, two solitary, wounded souls had finally found their sanctuary, not in the stone walls around them, but in each other. The fall of Gaius Fulvius was as swift as it was silent. In Rome, a man's worth was measured by his honor and his connections, and Marcus had stripped him of both. His powerful associates abandoned him, his debtors grew bold and defaulted, and his rivals moved in to pick apart his empire of greed. Within a year, he was ruined. The last time his name was whispered in the Forum, it was said he had been seen, begging for scraps in the very same grimy streets where he had once thrown a widow and her children, a bitter ghost haunted by his own cruelty. His fate was a forgotten footnote in the city's endless story. But at the villa in the hills, a new story was being written, not in ink but in seasons of peace. 5 years later, the setting sun cast a warm, golden light over the estate. The villa was transformed. The once severe lines of the house were softened by climbing roses, and the garden in the peristyle, once a solemn place of laurel and cypress, was now a riot of color and life. Fragrant herbs grew next to simple, beautiful flowers, and a small patch of vegetables showed the touch of a practical hand. The air, once silent and heavy with memory, now carried the sound of laughter. Marcus, his face gentler and etched with softer lines, wore the simple tunic of a country landowner, his military cloak long since stored away. He stood in the center of the lawn with a taller, stronger Lucius. He was adjusting the boy's grip on a real, though still blunted, practice sword, his voice a low, patient murmur. He was not training a soldier, he was teaching a son. Nearby, sitting on a stone bench, Livia watched them, a quiet smile on her face. Her simple dress was that of a respected, the lady of the house. Beside her, Cassia, no longer a terrified toddler, was weaving a garland of flowers, her small fingers mimicking her mother's graceful movements. Livia was the calm, steady heart of this world, the source of its warmth and its life. She looked up from her daughter's work, her eyes finding her husband's across the garden. Marcus, feeling her gaze, paused his instruction and looked at her. In that single, shared glance, a decade of life passed between them. The memory of the cold rain, the desperation of her plea, the terror of the summons, all of it was there, but it was now a distant landscape, the foundation upon which this incredible peace had been built. His hard general's eyes, once filled with ghosts, now held only a deep, unwavering contentment he had never thought possible. He smiled, a rare, soft expression that was meant only for her. She returned it, her heart full. He gave Lucius a final pat on the shoulder and walked over to the bench. He sat down beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. He said nothing, but reached out and took her hand, their fingers lacing together in a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. Together, they watched their children play in the golden light. They had faced the world and won. They had built a sanctuary, not of high stone walls, but of unwavering devotion. The story that had begun with a desperate cry for help in a merciless city had found its end here in the profound and lasting peace of a quiet sunset.